Hello again, Books Sandwiched In. I'm Jonathan Haupt, the Executive Director of our nonprofit Pat Conroy Literary Center here in downtown Beaufort. Happy to do my small part in introducing this week's Books Sandwiched In presenter, Margaret F. Pickett. Peggy is just a phenomenal historian and author and a historical interpreter of the life of Eliza Lucas Pinckney. And if you don't know Eliza's story, then prepare to be amazed in the next hour. She helped revolutionize the economy of colonial America and effectively saved the colonies. It's an incredible story. It made all the more remarkable because Eliza did this as a teenager. It's a story I'm currently teaching to my own teenage protege, legendary Conroy Center student intern and pride of Beaufort High School, Holland Perryman. And I'm teaching this to Holland not only by way of Peggy's remarkable book, which she will share with you here in Books Sandwiched In, but also through a book that Peggy, in her way, helped inspire, a historical novel of the life of Eliza Lucas Pinckney called The Indigo Girl, written by my friend Natasha Boyd. Natasha was once a fellow resident of our beloved Low Country. She is a USA Today and Wall Street Journal best-selling author. And because she adores Peggy as much as I do, Natasha has very generously offered to help introduce Peggy for Books Sandwiched In. So here she is.
Good afternoon. My name is Natasha Boyd, and I'm absolutely thrilled today to be introducing Peggy Pickett, Margaret F. Pickett. Peggy and I met many years ago. In fact, our first meeting, I'm not sure she met me because I met Eliza very briefly. I was at an event at a gallery on Hilton Head Island, and Peggy was there as a living Eliza Lucas Pinckney, and I had never heard of Eliza Lucas. I had married a man from Charleston, had heard the name Pinckney many times in all my visits, and was stunned to hear the story of Eliza. So stunned, in fact, that I left that evening and dug around into research as much as I could find, of which there was scant around. And it culminated in me actually writing a book about Eliza, The Indigo Girl. But over the course of the years, and obviously while I was writing the book, I was very lucky to be seated next to Peggy at one of Pat Conroy's last signings for literacy. And we discussed Eliza. She shared with me that she was working on Eliza's biography, which was amazing because I was working on a book about Eliza too, a fictionalized account of just the first 5 years in South Carolina. So I always maintain that I wish Peggy had written this remarkable book while I was writing mine. But it's okay because now it's out in the world, and whenever I give talks about Eliza and about the Indigo Girl in those years, invariably people want to know more. And where I send them is to Peggy's book, Eliza Lucas Pinckney, Colonial Plantation Manager and Mother of American Patriots. Sorry, I feel like I say it so much and I just suddenly forgot it. So highly recommend Peggy as one of the leading scholars on Eliza Lucas Pinckney, and you guys will be in for a treat today hearing all about Eliza's remarkable life. Thank you so much to Jonathan and to Peggy for inviting me to introduce Peggy, and have a great talk. Bye.
So I knew a lot about 17th and 18th century Virginia history, but about the only thing I knew about South Carolina was that the cash crops were rice and indigo. And I'd heard of Eliza Lucas Pinckney, but I had no idea that she had anything to do with indigo. So when I came here and decided that I needed to learn something about the new state that I was living in, I was at the Coastal Discovery Museum taking a tour, and the docent was showing us the grounds at the museum. And they have an area there where they have plants that were important in South Carolina's history. And of course, there were indigo plants there. And the docent said indigo was introduced into South Carolina in the 18th century by a teenage girl named Eliza Lucas. And I thought, that's fascinating. And I went home and I started doing some research on her, and I became even more intrigued and fascinated with her story. And since I had done living history in Virginia, um, I hadn't really intended to do any living history here in South Carolina, but once I was introduced to Eliza, I just had to portray her. And portraying her led to my writing a nonfiction biography of her life. It explores not only her life, but the 18th century world that she lived in. Um, of course, there is more to Eliza than Indigo, and all of that's included in the book. But today I wanted to talk specifically about Indigo, Eliza, and her connection with Indigo. And I want to answer 3 questions. The first question is, how did it happen that Eliza was given the responsibility of developing indigo on her father's plantation? And then why was indigo so important to the British, and why was it so important to South Carolinians? So to answer the first question, I need to give you some background information. Eliza was born on the island of Antigua when it was a British colony in the West Indies. The Lucas family was a very prominent and wealthy family on the island. Eliza's grandfather, John Lucas, was on the island by the year 1668. He was a member of the legislature. He owned 3 sugar plantations on the island. Now, in the 17th and 18th century, Europeans followed the mercantile theory of economics, which said the country should export more than they imported. They were to keep their money in their own country. Colonies were a very important part of that economic theory, because colonies were supposed to provide the mother country with raw materials that she could not make at home, thereby sparing the mother country the necessity of importing those raw materials from other countries. And in the 17th century, the 2 most lucrative products imported to Great Britain from the British colonies were tobacco and sugar. In 1686, the British imported 142,000 pounds worth of tobacco from their North American colonies in the Chesapeake. That would be Virginia and Maryland. But that same year, they imported 587,000 pounds worth of sugar from their island colonies in the West Indies. Sugar was so valuable that planters referred to it as white gold. And because it was so valuable and so lucrative, sugar planters on the islands cleared every available piece of land they had to plant the sugar cane. They left no woodlands to provide lumber to make barrels to put the sugar in, or wagons or carts or buildings. There was no pasture land to graze cattle, and there were no fields to raise corn and beans. All of these items had to be imported into the colony from the mainland colonies in North America or Ireland. Now, many of the planters on the sugar islands decided that it would be to their benefit if they had their own plantation in one of the southern colonies in North America. And that plantation could supply them with lumber and pork and beef and rice and corn and beans, which they needed. John Lucas, Eliza's grandfather, was one of those people. In 1714, he bought a 600-acre plantation on Wapoo Creek, just across the Ashley River from Charleston, right? Now, Eliza's father was George Lucas. He was the only surviving son of John Lucas. He was a soldier. He was a captain in the 38th Regiment of Foot. This was the regiment that was permanently stationed on the island of Antigua. He was a member of the Council of Government, which was a very prestigious position. He was part owner of a sugar plantation. But most important, he was the heir to 3 sugar plantations. Right? George and his wife Anne had 4 children. Eliza was the oldest. She was born in 1722. George was born in 1725, Thomas in 1728, and then the youngest child was Mary, or Polly, as she was often called, was born in 1735. Antigua is a small island, and in Eliza's day, there were no schools there. So planters generally sent their children back to England to attend boarding school in London when they were around the age of 10. Until that time, children were taught the rudiments of education by their mothers. Now, Eliza's mother suffered from some chronic illness or a chronic disorder, and she was not up to the task of teaching her daughter. So it was Eliza's father who saw to her education, which meant that Eliza had a slightly different education from most girls in her social level, right? She once remarked to one of her adult children that she was very early fond of the vegetable world. Eliza liked plants. She liked to experiment with plants. She had all kinds of little projects. Her father was so pleased with her interest in plants that he encouraged her. He even went so far as to say that he preferred her to work in the garden rather than to be inside doing needlework. And you have to understand that needlework was the fashionable employment for ladies in the 18th century. He also made a prediction. He said the skill that Eliza had with plants might produce something of real value. In 1729, John Lucas, Eliza's grandfather, died. He left his son George 3 sugar plantations, but he also left him a debt of 2,000 pounds, which was quite a lot of money in the 18th century. But George Lucas was not concerned. He had 3 sugar plantations, so he felt that he would have no trouble at all paying off this debt. Unfortunately, in 1730, Antigua was hit with a severe drought, which lasted for 6 years. Once the drought was over, the island was infested with insects, which sucked the juice from the sugarcane. George Lucas could not earn enough money each year because of his sugar crop was greatly curtailed. So he could not earn enough money in 1 year to pay his expenses. So he slowly drifted into debt. In 1732, his yearly expenses increased because Eliza was 10. It was time for her to go off to England to school. Now, education for girls was not important in the 18th century. So George Lucas could have saved himself a lot of money if he had not sent Eliza to school. But he was a firm believer in education, not only for his sons, but also for his daughters. So even though he could not afford it, in 1732, Eliza went off to London to attend Mrs. Pearson's boarding school. Planters in the 18th century, whether they were planting tobacco, rice, or sugar, lived on a financial edge. They would send their crop to London to sell. The money that they made from the sale of their crop would go to pay for the goods that they imported from England. If their income could not pay for all the goods that they ordered, then they pledged next year's crop. And every year, this is what George Lucas had to do. In 1735, his expenses went up because his son George was ready to go to school. And by 1735, George Lucas was 30,000 pounds in debt. He needed to recoup his fortunes, and he was going to do that by advancing his military career. He was a captain. He was planning to buy a commission as a major. In those days, ranks up to the rank of major had to be purchased. After that, it was a promotion. So he needed to purchase a commission as a major, and he needed new lands and new crops. Well, there were no new lands available on the island of Antigua. But George Lucas had inherited a plantation in South Carolina from his father. So he went to South Carolina. He mortgaged the plantation on Wappoo Creek, and he purchased 3,000 acres of rice growing land on the Waccamaw River and a 1,500-acre plantation called Garden Hill on the Combahee River. These are two prime rice growing areas in South Carolina. Now, in 1737, Eliza returned from school. Her father spent a couple of months with her, explaining to her how sugar. Excuse me. He spent a couple of months with her to explain how sugar plantations were run, because he was planning to go to England, to London, and buy his commission as a major and to enroll his youngest son in school. And he was going to leave Eliza in charge of his sugar plantations. Now, normally he would have left his wife in charge. In the 18th century, marriages were partnerships. The husband, of course, was the senior partner. The wife was the junior partner. And in a family business, and farms, plantations were family businesses like running a tavern or a store or having a blacksmith shop. The wife was supposed to be a partner in the family business. And when her husband left or was incapacitated, she took over the running of the business. But Mrs. Lucas was not able to do that. So the job went to Eliza. And girls in the 18th century were taught from the time they were very little that they were supposed to be useful to their male relatives, their father, their husbands, their brothers, their sons, and so forth. So this would be something that Eliza would have been expecting to do. And it was not difficult. George Lucas was only gone for 3 or 4 months. And then when he returned, he called his creditors together and he said, "You may have the income from all my sugar plantations to pay off the debts that I owe you. I want to make sure that you don't touch my military commission and you don't touch any of my property in South Carolina." And his creditors agreed. So George Lucas at this time decided that he would move his family to South Carolina. In the late summer of 1739, they arrived at Charleston. That was George Lucas, his wife Anne, and his daughters Eliza and Mary. His 2 sons were still in school in England. They settled in one of the houses that George Lucas owned in Charleston. They were there for a couple of months, and England declared war on Spain. Major George Lucas was recalled to Antigua to join his military regiment, right? Who is he going to leave in charge of his rice plantations? Eliza. He gave her a choice. He said, "While I'm gone, would you rather live in the country or would you rather live in town?" And Eliza said, "I'd rather live in the country." So she and her mother and Mary moved to the Wapu plantation. Now, at this time, Eliza was just approaching her 17th birthday. Her father left in November of 1739, and she turned 17 at the end of December in that year. What were 17-year-old girls in the 18th century doing at this time? Well, I can tell you one thing. They weren't managing rice plantations. This is what they were doing. They were attending balls, musical evenings, going to plays, going to visit relatives in other cities or colonies, or even going back to England for a visit. This was the time of their life when they were supposed to be free from responsibilities, because as soon as they married, they would be having all the responsibilities of being a wife, mother, and mistress of a plantation. And instead, Eliza has the business of 3 plantations to transact. And when she said business, that's what she meant. All the paperwork, the writing of the letters, the conferring with lawyers, writing to the business factor in London, writing letters to her father. The day-to-day management of the 3 rice plantations was done by the overseers. But Eliza did manage to engage in some social activity. She goes into Charleston whenever she can. But there are times when she's invited to a social event that she has to decline the invitation because, as she said, of work that could not be delayed. So what is Eliza's reaction to this? She wrote to a friend in England, "Lest you should think it too burthensome to a girl at my early time of life, I assure you I think myself happy that I can be useful to so good a father." Wouldn't it be interesting to have a teenager say that to a parent today? Yeah. But Eliza was very fond of her father. They had formed a bond when he was seeing to her education. And Eliza also knew that her father had made a great financial sacrifice to send her to school, and she was always very grateful to him for that. Now, George Lucas, besides asking his daughter to look after his rice plantations for him, he also had another job for her. He wanted to diversify on his plantations. He did not want to rely entirely on his rice crop for his entire income. So when he got to Antigua, he sent Eliza some seeds, and he asked her to use her skill with plants and tell him which of these plants would grow best in South Carolina. She planted indigo, cotton, alfalfa, ginger, and cassava. Now, in case you're wondering what cassava is, it's a plant that's native to Central America, the islands, perhaps South America. It has a starchy root. We get tapioca from the root of the cassava plant. The native people in the Central America and the islands pounded the root to make flour, to make bread out of. It was a food staple in the West Indies and Central America. If George Lucas could have grown this plant on his plantation in South Carolina, he would have had a ready market for it. But it's a tropical plant, as is ginger, and neither one of them would grow here. She had very indifferent results from the alfalfa, so she gave up on that. Cotton grew well here, but only for domestic use because there was no cotton gin yet, and it was very labor intensive and tedious to hand pick the seed from the cotton. Indigo was the plant that she had the most hopes for, so it's indigo that she concentrated her efforts on. Now, there are over 700 species of indigo plants in the world, but it appears that these are the two that we use to make the dye. It is the leaves of the indigo plant that are used to make the dye. So there was something different about the leaves of these two species that made them prime plants for making the indigo dye. Now, the top one was native to Asia, and I will not try to pronounce either one of these. So the top one is native to Asia, the bottom one is native to the Americas, and that's the plant that Eliza was using, and everyone in the Americas were using that plant, right? The indigo plant is not a perennial. The plant forms a seed pod, and in the fall of the year, those seed pods have to be harvested, and the seed has to be saved to plant the next year. Eliza had no difficulty growing the indigo plant, but she had problems with the seed. The first year, not knowing anything about the growing season in South Carolina, she planted this, or had the seed planted too late in the year. By the time the seed pods were ready to harvest, they had been hit with a frost, which damaged a lot of the seed. She picked out the best seed and had it planted the next spring, but the crop was very small. So she decided the next year she would use seed from her plants and she asked her father to send her some seed from the West Indies. But the seed that he sent was not good and none of it came up. So she decided at that point that from now on, she would just use seed from her own plants and not rely on seed being sent from the West Indies. So the next year she had a very good crop, but she called them worms. Something came and ate a lot of the leaves. Finally, in 1744, she had a crop that she was pleased with. Now, while she was struggling to grow the indigo plants, she was also having experiments done with making small amounts of the dye. That is a very precise process, and it requires careful timing. Eliza knew nothing about how to make the dye, so her father hired an indigo maker, a man to supervise the making of the dye. His name was Nicholas Cromwell, and he was from the island of Montserrat, where they produced indigo. Okay? Now, the first step in the process of making the dye is, of course, to plant the seeds. And in South Carolina, they planted the seeds in the early part of March. By June, the plants were 3 or 4 feet high, and they were harvested. They were cut about 3 or 4 inches from the ground. This gave the plant a chance to grow back so that the indigo planter could get another cutting from the same plant. So that meant that each year he got 2 cuttings from his indigo plants, and he could make 2 batches of indigo from the same plant. In Florida, planters could get 3 cuttings a season, and in the West Indies, it got 4 to 6 cuttings. But in South Carolina, it was 2, right? Once the plants have been cut, the stems and the leaves are put together in bundles, as you see in the picture here. The bundles of stems and leaves are then taken to the indigo vats. The vats are generally built of wood. They're on platforms, and each vat is lower than the one before it. So they're like steps, and here they are. So in the top vat then go all the bundles of stalks and leaves. They are covered with a mixture of water and urine. Now, indigo is not soluble in water. It needs a chemical so that it can be absorbed. And whatever is in the urine did the trick. So they're covered with this mixture of water and urine. Flat boards are put on top of them because they have to be kept completely submerged. They're left to soak there for 20 to 24 hours. And during that time, the leaves begin to decay. They break down. And as they do, they release a blue color into the surrounding liquid. And after a time, the entire mixture begins to bubble and boil, like water boiling in a pot. Slowly, at first, the bubbles rise to the top, and then they come faster and faster, and a blue froth collects in the corners. And this is a very critical time in the whole process. The indigo maker must watch the liquid most carefully. And when, in his judgment, the bubbles are rising fast enough, and the blue froth in the corners is just the right color, then he knows it's time for the next step to be taken. All of the liquid from the first vat is drained into the lower second vat. The rotting stems and leaves are then carted away. The liquid in the second vat is beaten by workers who stir it with wooden paddles. That's to get air into the mixture. The beating continues for 18 to 20 minutes, or until the entire mixture is turned a yellowish greenish brown, and there appear to be small pieces of blue mud floating in it. At this point, lime water is added. The lime water was made by mixing burnt and crushed oyster shells with water. Lime water is added, it's beaten once again, and slowly a clear liquid rises to the top, and all the little pebbles of blue mud sink to the bottom. That blue mud contains the dye. Right, the liquid from the top vat is drained off. The blue mud is scooped up and placed in the last vat to drain. And here you can see the pipe coming out, the water's coming out. The drained mud then is kneaded by hand until it's smooth. It's pressed into boxes and cut into 1.5-inch squares called indigo bricks. The bricks are then placed in the drying house, and that's just a pavilion. No walls and large open shelves so air can circulate. It takes 3 weeks from the time that the indigo leaves are placed in the first vat to soak until these little bricks are dry enough to be packed into barrels for shipment. Now, Nicholas Cromwell arrived in South Carolina in the late summer of 1741. He was able to make a small amount of dye that fall, but the indigo bricks that he made were so poor and quality that they were worthless. Now, Eliza was not too disturbed because the indigo that he used to make the leaves, it had been standing in the fields for a long time because he did not arrive until the late summer, and then he had to build his vat. So she thought perhaps the next year the indigo would be better, but it was still bad. And she was not very satisfied. Cromwell blamed the poor quality of the dye upon the climate. He said this was not the right place to grow. The indigo that grows here will not make decent dye. But Eliza was not convinced of that. And she started doing some observations. She had her neighbor, Mr. Defoe, an elderly Huguenot gentleman that knew something about indigo. She had him come and watch. And it was Mr. Defoe who told her that he thought that Cromwell had put too much lime water into the mixture, and that's what had spoiled the color. Later, Cromwell was overheard to say that he was sorry that he had come to Carolina because he did not want indigo from Carolina to compete with indigo from his native country. Now, whether he deliberately sabotaged the indigo or whether he was just terribly bad at making it, we will never know. But in 1744, his contract was over and he was sent back to Montserrat. He was replaced by his brother Patrick, who was able to make 17 pounds of good dye. In May of 1744, Eliza had married Charles Pinckney. So it's Charles Pinckney who sent 6 pounds of that dye back to England. And he asked the South Carolina representative in London, try this dye something with it and let me know if it's good. The agent wrote back and he said, yes, it's as good as the dye that the British have been buying from the French. And how much of it do you think South Carolina can make? There was great excitement in Great Britain over the possibility of getting indigo from South Carolina. So why was indigo so valuable to the British? Well, they have a textile industry in Great Britain. And so naturally they need dyes of all colors to dye the cloth that they made. But the blue color was especially important for the military. Now, we all know what color coats the British soldiers wore from the Revolutionary War. They wore red coats, but the Royal Navy wore blue. So the blue dye was needed to dye the wool to make uniforms for the Royal Navy. Indigo originally came from India. It made its way to Europe, and by the 17th century, it was the preferred blue dye. Before the introduction of indigo, Europeans were making blue dye from a plant called woad, W-O-A-D. But the dye that plant produced was not as strong as the dye that made from indigo, and it faded. So indigo was always the preferred dye. In the 18th century, the British imported most of the indigo that they used from the West Indies. Unfortunately, there was only one British colony that made indigo, and that was Montserrat. The rest of them belonged to the French. They were spending 200,000 to 400,000 pounds a year buying indigo from French colonies in the West Indies. Now, from 1690 to 1815, the countries of Europe were involved in a series of wars. I think there were like 7 of them. The wars were fought to maintain the balance of power in Europe. So with every war, the European countries changed their allies. There was only one constant. England and France were always on the opposite side. So when there was a war, the British could not get any indigo at all. And when there was not a war, they were paying a country they were constantly fighting, they were paying them 200,000 to 400,000 pounds a year. That is why they were so excited about the possibility of getting indigo from one of their colonies in North America. Okay. So why was indigo important to South Carolina planters? Well, in the 1730s, the price of rice was very high. And so planters tended to plant more of it because they were getting such a good price for it. By 1740, the price of rice had fallen, and it was due in part to overproduction, but mostly it was caused by a war. The war with Spain, which had taken George Lucas back to Antigua, had developed into the War of the Austrian Succession. These wars that the Europeans fought, they were world wars because they were fought wherever European countries had colonies or trading stations. So the continent of Europe, the continent of North America, the West Indies, the coast of Africa, the Far East, there was fighting all over. And so there were ships everywhere, warships, privateers that preyed on the shipping. And I would like to read you a section from the book dealing with this. Okay. George Lucas, trying to recoup his fortunes with his property in South Carolina, was also a victim of the war. He had acquired his South Carolina plantations in the 1730s when the price of rice was high. However, in the 1740s, the price began to fall, caused in part by overproduction, but mostly caused by the war, which disrupted markets in Europe and the West Indies and caused freight costs to rise. Rice was a bulky product to ship, and plantation owners depended on low shipping rates to transport their product to market. But the dangers of ocean travel in times of war drove up insurance rates and consequently drove down the price of rice. Eliza reported to her father, "The rice crop at Garden Hill turned out ill, but 160 barrels, and at Wapu only 43. The price is so very low as 30 shillings per hundred. We have sent very little to town yet for that reason." Many planters in South Carolina relied solely on their rice crop for their income and were content to allow their fortunes to rise and fall with its price. There were others, though, who diversified by engaging in outside ventures, such as owning a mill or a fleet of boats to transport their neighbors' crops to town. However, few, if any, outside of George Lucas, considered the possibility of cultivating a second cash crop on their plantations to offset the vagaries of the market. But as the war dragged on and trade continued to be interrupted and the price of rice kept falling, the idea of a second crop became more and more appealing to many planters. The time was right for the introduction of indigo. Right? Now, Eliza and Charles saved most of their crop in 1744 for seed, and they gave the seed out to anyone in South Carolina that wanted to plant it. Rice planters were excited because indigo could be grown on the high ground between their rice fields, and since the rice and indigo needed attention at different times of the year, the same labor force could cultivate both crops. One field hand could manage 2 or 3 acres of rice One field hand could manage 2 or 3 acres of indigo plus 2 acres of rice. But the beauty of indigo was that it wasn't restricted to only one area like rice, because indigo could be grown in many different places. It could be grown in the Midlands, it could be grown in the backcountry, and it was especially important here on the Sea Islands, where the presence of saltwater marshes made the cultivation of rice difficult. Right? In 1747, 135,000 pounds of indigo was exported to Great Britain from South Carolina. The next year, the British Parliament authorized the payment of a bounty of 6 pence a pound on indigo produced in British America and exported directly to Great Britain. The wealth spread. Indigo planters were said to double their capital every 3 or 4 years. If sugar was white gold, then indigo was blue gold. By the time of the American Revolution, the colonies of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida were exporting over 1 million pounds of indigo to Great Britain every year. And George Lucas's prophecy had come true. His daughter, had used her skill with plants to produce something of real value. Thank you.